She's not going to make it if we don't get help. Now!" The voice came from a security guard at the ER entrance, but his words weren't directed at a person. They were directed at a dog. A battered, panting German shepherd was dragging something behind him, and when the hospital staff rushed out, they froze. It wasn't a blanket or an old jacket. It was a child, a little girl, barely 10, bloodied, unconscious, and curled into the shepherd's side like he'd been shielding her from the end of the world. The dog's legs were shaking, one ear torn, fur soaked with mud and streaked with red, but he refused to back away. As doctors knelt beside the girl, the dog growled low, not out of threat but fear, like he thought they might take her from him forever. The girl's name, they later learned, was Aria Monroe. She hadn't spoken in over 2 days. No ID, no shoes, no clear story. Just bruises, bite marks from something wild, and eyes that wouldn't open. The only clue was the dog, collarless, wounded, and coated in forest debris. But he stayed beside her stretcher through the entire ER chaos, refusing food, ignoring his own bleeding paw, his gaze locked on her face as if she were his entire mission. When someone tried to pull him away, he snapped, not to attack, but to plead. The staff backed. "Off," one nurse whispered. "Let him stay. He's the only reason she's alive." That night, the rain hadn't stopped, and according to a ranger who later investigated, there'd been flash flooding in the lower woods near the Monroe family's rural home. The entire area had been declared unstable, roads washed out, trees collapsed, access impossible. Yet somehow that dog had crossed miles of unstable terrain with an unconscious child strapped to him by vines and a torn bedsheet. Aria's wrists bore tiny rope marks. Something, or someone, had tied her up before the flood. And the dog had carried her out. No one knew where he came from. No microchip, no tags, just scars. Some were old, some fresh, but all told a story of violence, survival, and loyalty. In the hours that followed, while Aria remained in a medically induced sleep, the dog refused to leave the hospital corridor. He howled when she was wheeled to the ICU, paced in circles when nurses passed by with her blood samples, and only stopped moving when they brought him her sock. He pressed his nose into it, lay down beside it, and didn't sleep for almost 48 hours. The moment Aria opened her eyes, there was no confusion, no panic. She simply whispered, "Echo," and the dog, waiting silently in the hallway, lifted his head like someone had called him home. The nurses had never seen anything like it. He walked into her room like he'd been given permission by heaven itself and gently rested his head on her arm. Her vitals spiked, not dangerously, but powerfully. Her fingers curled into his fur. A single tear rolled down her cheek, and she whispered again, "You found me." No one could explain it yet. Not the police, not the hospital, not the trauma counselor who had driven in from the next county. But it became clear that Echo was not just a stray. He was a guardian, a trained soldier maybe, or a dog with a memory too sharp to forget what had been taken from him. And now, somehow, he'd found her. A child he was never supposed to meet, but whom fate had tethered him to like a final mission. The more they looked into Aria's past, the darker the mystery became. Her family had been missing for over a week. Her parents hadn't checked into work. A neighbor's report about screams on the edge of the woods had been dismissed as thunder during the storm. But the girl, barely clinging to life, had survived. Because something in that dog refused to let her die. That first night in recovery, Aria didn't ask for toys. She didn't ask for her parents. She didn't even ask for food. She just looked at Echo and whispered, "Thank you for not letting go." And as the room dimmed and monitors beeped quietly beside her, the dog climbed carefully onto her bed and curled around her like a living blanket of protection. No one could believe what had followed that storm, but those who saw it never forgot. Because sometimes the most heroic rescuer doesn't wear a uniform or carry a badge. Sometimes he walks into a hospital bleeding and broken, carrying a child who still had a chance to live. Dr. Leanne Carter had worked the night shift for 7 years at Ridgeview County Hospital, but nothing had ever left her this shaken. She stood outside the glass-paneled ICU room, watching the girl sleep with the dog curled around her. The monitors blinked quietly, rhythmically, but her mind wasn't on vitals anymore. It was on the questions. Too many questions. Who left this girl out there? How long had she been alone? And how had this dog, this unnamed, collarless, battle-scarred German shepherd, carried her across a forest during a storm and brought her to safety? When Aria finally woke up fully, She wouldn't say much, just a few words at a time. Echo saved me, she'd whisper. He didn't leave me. Sometimes her fingers would curl in his fur, her eyes would flick toward the window, and her lips would go still. She had seen something. Leanne could feel it. But whatever it was, the memory hadn't fully surfaced. Or maybe it had, and Arya had chosen not to speak it aloud. Trauma did that to children. It hid truth inside silence. The police arrived later that morning. Officer Raymond Torres took notes quickly, studying the dog with a kind of confused awe. No chip, no tag, no K9 registry under the name Echo, he murmured, crouching near the animal but keeping his distance. But you look like you've seen war, buddy. Echo didn't growl. He didn't move. He just kept one eye on Arya, ears twitching at every beep or footstep. When a staff member came too close with a syringe, he let out a low whimper, not a warning, just a protective plea. He's not letting her out of his sight, Raymond muttered. Whatever happened, out there. She's the only thing that matters to him now. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, whispers began to spread. A nurse had posted an anonymous update in a local Facebook group about a heroic dog and a mystery girl. Within hours, dozens of people were asking questions. Had a child gone missing? Was there a reward? One user claimed they'd seen flashing lights near Black Hollow Creek the night of the storm, lights that disappeared too quickly. Another mentioned strange howling around the same area, followed by gunshots. Sheriff Mullins, who'd been mostly silent on the case, now called for a coordinated search of the woods, starting from the old ranger station and spiraling outward. Inside the hospital, Arya began drawing. Crayons were brought in, and she clung to the green and red ones. At first the pictures were simple. Trees, a cabin, a river. Then they grew darker. A shack with chains. A cage. Red marks like fire surrounding stick figures. One figure had no face. Another had X's for eyes. In every single drawing, the dog was there. Bigger than life, teeth bared, always standing between her and the danger. Did someone keep you there, Arya? Leanne asked softly one afternoon, trying to sound casual as she sat beside her with a juice box. Arya didn't answer at first. She just looked down at her knees, then whispered, "He bit the man who hurt me. He broke the door." Her voice trembled, but her grip on Echo tightened. He didn't stop even when he got hit. He came back for me. Leanne's heart sank. This wasn't a story about a girl getting lost. This was deeper, more terrifying. Echo hadn't just found her by chance. He'd rescued her from something, or someone, and judging by his injuries and her trauma, it had nearly cost both of them everything. That night, Echo stood up abruptly in the hospital corridor. His ears shot back, hackles raised. It was 2:17 a.m. The hospital was quiet, but Echo growled. Low, sharp, controlled. Leanne, who was reviewing notes at the nurse's station, noticed him pacing, nose to the floor, then toward the stairwell. "What is it?" she murmured, following him. He stopped at the stairwell door and let out a sound no one had heard him make before, a short, urgent bark. Moments later, a man appeared at the side entrance of the hospital. No one knew how he got through. Cameras had glitched due to a nearby electrical repair. But Echo didn't need footage to recognize him. The moment the man stepped inside, Echo's reaction was instant. His body turned rigid, his eyes locked forward, and he bolted before anyone could stop him. Security footage showed the shepherd sprinting down the hall like a bullet, straight toward the side entrance. The man fled. He didn't get far. Officer Torres was outside speaking to a journalist when he heard the bark. He turned just in time to see the man leap over the railing toward the bushes, only to be tackled mid-air by the dog. Echo had launched from the top of the ramp, latching onto the man's coat with trained precision. Not wild, not random, precise, deliberate, protective. The man screamed, and Torres drew his weapon, shouting for Echo to release. He did, on command. But he never stopped blocking the path between the man and the hospital entrance. When Torres cuffed him, the man's face went pale. It was him. He found her? He's still alive?" The words weren't meant for anyone, but everyone heard them. Echo sat down, panting, not in triumph, but in relief. By sunrise, the man had confessed to holding multiple children over the past 3 years in a cabin deep in the woods. Arya had been the latest, but he hadn't expected Echo to survive the trap he'd set, a metal snare designed to crush a dog's ribs. But somehow, Echo had clawed free, returned to the cabin, and carried Arya away before the rising flood consumed the area. The cabin was found 3 days later, half submerged, empty, but littered with locks, syringes, and evidence of horrors too dark to describe. Arya never spoke of it again. She didn't need to. What remained now was Echo, scarred, tired, but whole, and Arya, who could finally sleep again, curled beside him under a real blanket, in a real room, with the past behind her. But the most unbelievable part was still to come. By the next day, Ridgeview Hospital had transformed from a quiet rural facility to the focal point of a growing media storm. News trucks lined the nearby road. Reporters loitered by the front desk. Camera flashes reflected off every hallway window. The story of the unknown girl and her war-scarred canine guardian was now spiraling far beyond anyone's control. But, amid the public fascination, something much more serious was unfolding behind the scenes. Detective Marlon Reeves had been assigned the case personally by the county sheriff. He wasn't just there to supervise security or entertain reporters. He had seen enough broken children in his career to know when a case was about to take a dark turn. And everything about Arya's trauma pointed to something far more sinister than an accident in the woods. After reviewing the night's hospital, surveillance footage, interviewing Officer Torres, and watching the moment Echo attacked the mysterious intruder, Marlon knew they weren't just dealing with a rescue story. They were staring straight into the eyes of something much deeper and far more evil. Meanwhile, inside the hospital, Arya hadn't let go of Echo once. She barely slept unless his head was tucked under her arm. She barely spoke unless he was touching her. But when she did speak, the things she said chilled the room. "He tried to sell me," she murmured one evening to Nurse Kara, staring at the window like she was seeing something from far away. "He had phones and cameras and that white bag with the red zipper, that's where he put the money." Kara didn't know what to say. She just squeezed the girl's hand and quietly alerted Dr. Carter, who recorded every word and passed them on to Detective Reeves. Later that same night, something changed in Echo too. He'd spent every hour alert, pacing between Arya's bed and the door, but now he was growling at the vents, barking once at the window, staring into corners with the intensity of a dog who knew danger not by sight, but by scent. Reeves noticed this immediately. He crouched beside him and said quietly, "What are you trying to tell us, boy?" They swept the hospital again. Nothing. But the following morning, an anonymous package arrived at the hospital's back gate. No return address, just a USB drive taped to the inside. The contents left the entire precinct stunned. Grainy footage showed a rundown wooden shack in the woods. Inside, a single cot, a small cage, a girl, Arya, duct tape over her mouth, a steel collar around her ankle, and in the background, Echo, chained and bleeding, but growling low, never turning away from the man behind the camera. There were clips of him trying to reach Arya, crawling, dragging himself forward, and then finally, what must have been, just before the rescue, a shot of Echo lunging, biting through the chain, then crashing through the shack door with the child slumped on his back. The timestamp showed the exact night of the storm. The sheriff's department launched a coordinated raid that same afternoon. They returned to the location where Echo had likely come from, deep inside the flood-ruined sector near Black Hollow Creek. What they found was a compound, partially destroyed by rain and tree fall, but still wired with security systems, pressure sensors, and storage containers filled with IDs, clothing, and phones, none of which belonged to Arya. This wasn't a one-time event. This was a trafficking site, and Arya had been only one of many. The mood in the hospital shifted completely. Arya's drawings became more detailed. Her stick figures now had names: Tony, Layla, Misha. Some were crossed out, some were circled. Dr. Carter began to wonder if she wasn't just remembering them, but mourning them. The weight of what had happened hadn't even fully reached the staff yet, but the dog knew. He had known all along. That's why he never barked without cause. That's why he stood so still when strangers entered. That's why he'd nearly torn down a steel door to carry one little girl through the mud in the middle of a lightning storm. But it was what came next that none of them expected. Reeves contacted military K-9 units around the country, sending Echo's image and a full behavioral profile. Days later, a match returned from Fort Hammond's now-defunct K-9 Tactical Division. Echo's real name had been Barron, registered 3 years ago to Sergeant Colton Vance, who had died in a classified transport ambush overseas. Barron had been presumed dead, lost in the explosion. But what no one realized was that Barron had survived, escaped, and vanished. Somehow he'd ended up halfway across the country, and now he was here, acting not as a stray, but as a soldier, fulfilling one final mission. When Reeves showed Arya the photo of Colton, she didn't speak for a long time. She just stared. Then she whispered, "That's the man from the dream, the one who told Echo to find me." Dr. Carter's eyes filled with tears. "Maybe," she said quietly. "Echo didn't get lost. Maybe he was sent." And that changed everything. Within 48 hours, the governor declared the uncovered trafficking ring a state emergency. Law enforcement from 5 counties joined forces to track down other victims. Arya's testimony, though fragmented, became critical. Echo was recognized posthumously as a military K9 hero. He was granted permanent civilian placement with Arya's family. A fundraiser was created by Ridgeview staff to support his long-term care, which raised over $50,000 in a single week. But to Echo, none of that mattered. All he wanted was to lie next to Arya at night. And to her, he wasn't a hero or a legend. He was simply the one who never let go. But there was one last moment, quiet, small, that brought it all full circle. A week later, in the quiet garden behind the hospital, Arya sat on a wooden bench with her arms around Echo. Reeves approached with a single box. Inside was Echo's original military badge. Arya took it gently, studied the scratches on the metal, then whispered to the dog, "You were never just a stray. You were always a soldier." Echo licked her cheek once and lay down beside her with a soft exhale. And in that peaceful silence, nothing else needed to be said, because sometimes the loudest stories are carried by those who never speak at all. The moment Arya whispered that she had seen Sergeant Colton in a dream, telling Echo to find her, the entire room fell still. No one moved. Not the doctors, not the detective, not even the nurse holding her chart. It was as if her words had opened a doorway. None of them had been prepared to enter. Dr. Carter exchanged a glance with Detective Reeves, her face pale, her lips trembling. They both knew Arya had never seen Colton's picture before, never heard his name, yet she'd described him with chilling accuracy. His uniform, the scar under his right eye, the silver cross he wore around his neck, all details hidden from public records. For a brief moment, it didn't feel like a case anymore. It felt like something sacred, something far beyond comprehension. How could a traumatized girl, barely old enough to spell her own name, dream of a soldier presumed dead in action? How could a dog, left behind, battered and broken, travel across the country, through storms and danger, to find a girl no one even knew was missing? But there was no time to dwell on metaphysics, because what none of them realized was that someone had been watching. The same man Echo had attacked in the hospital hallway, the man who had escaped into the night. He hadn't vanished. He'd been circling, watching, waiting. That night, the hospital went into lockdown. It began with a missing security guard. Then came the power outage. And then, in the basement near the storage wing, a nurse screamed. Within seconds, alarms echoed through the halls. Reeves drew his weapon. 2 officers rushed toward the stairwells. Echo, who had been asleep beside Arya's bed, snapped to his feet with a low, guttural growl. He bolted from the room, ignoring everyone's shouts. Arya screamed after him, "Echo, please come back!" But he didn't stop. He never stopped. When something was wrong, Reeves followed, heart pounding. And what he found in the hospital's west wing changed everything. In a dim hallway lined with medical carts and defibrillator cabinets, Echo stood facing the intruder, his hackles raised, eyes burning with fury. The man's face was half covered by a surgical mask, but his eyes were unmistakable, cold, calculating, the same eyes from the surveillance footage. He was holding something behind his back, and Reeves didn't wait to see what it was. "Hands up! Don't move!" The man bolted. What followed was a chase through the emergency exit stairwell, down 3 flights into the rear parking garage. Reeves was fast, but Echo was faster. The dog leapt over railings, dodged between support beams, and finally cornered the suspect against a chain-link gate. The man raised a knife. Echo lunged. The blade slashed across his shoulder, but the K9 didn't flinch. He went straight for the man's wrist, clamped down, and didn't let go until Reeves tackled him from behind and snapped the cuffs on his bleeding hands. The suspect was taken into custody, and when his face was shown to Arya the next morning, she buried her face in her hands and whispered, "That's him." The rest unraveled quickly. The man was identified as Marcus Velen, a convicted human trafficker who had escaped a transport convoy 3 years earlier. He had been operating under false identities ever since, bouncing between underground networks across the Midwest. Aria had been one of at least a dozen children taken within the last 6 months, all from broken homes, shelters, or disaster zones, but she was the only one who had escaped because of Echo. As Reeves reviewed the timeline, a single, undeniable truth emerged. Echo hadn't just rescued a child, he had exposed an entire network. One mistake, one misstep, one moment of weakness in a hospital hallway had led to the collapse of a years-long operation that had slipped through countless hands. But justice came with a cost. Echo's wound was deep. The knife had sliced muscle and tendon. Dr. Carter and a veterinary surgeon worked side by side for hours, trying to save the limb. Aria stayed outside the operating room the entire time, refusing food, refusing sleep. She just waited, her tiny frame curled up in the hallway, clutching the soldier's badge that Reeves had given her. Finally, after hours of silence, Dr. Carter stepped out with tears in her eyes and nodded. He made it. Aria didn't cry. She just whispered, "He's all I have." The hospital erupted in quiet applause. Nurses hugged each other. Officers wiped away tears. Even Reeves, hardened by years of trauma, turned away to collect himself, because in that single, fragile child's voice was everything. The rest of the week moved like a dream. Aria's recovery accelerated. Her nightmares became less frequent. She began to draw again, this time, pictures of Echo in a superhero cape, flying through clouds, holding a girl in his paws. The hospital created a special badge for him, K9 Hero, Operation Echo. A ceremony was held in the garden. Reporters came, speeches were made, donations poured in, but nothing mattered more than one quiet moment, one evening, as the sun set behind the hills, casting golden light across the hospital lawn. Aria sat beside Echo in the grass. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a piece of string she had braided herself. At the end was a dog tag she'd made from an old soda can, engraved with her initials and his. She tied it gently around his neck, kissed his nose, and whispered, "You came back for me, so now I'll never leave you." Echo wagged his tail once, rested his head on her lap, and closed his eyes. And for the first time since he left that battlefield 3 years ago, the soldier finally rested, not alone, not abandoned, but exactly where he was always meant to be. 6 weeks had passed since that terrifying night in the hospital, the night Echo chased down a man the authorities had failed to track for years. The night when a wounded girl found her voice through the silent loyalty of a dog who refused to give up on her. Since then, everything had changed. Aria was no longer just the missing girl. She was now the centerpiece of a nationwide investigation that had spread like wildfire. Her story, and more importantly, Echo's unshakable devotion, had touched people in ways words couldn't explain. Letters arrived from all over the country. Children sent drawings. Veterans sent medals. One man, a retired colonel from California, even mailed Echo his own Bronze Star. From one soldier to another, the note read, "For bravery no one will ever understand, but everyone should honor." But even with the headlines and ceremonies, the real healing didn't happen in the spotlight. It happened in the quiet corners of a children's therapy center in upstate Missouri, where Aria and Echo had been transferred to recover together. No camera crews, no flashing lights, just soft-spoken nurses, gentle routines, and a room with a view of the hills. It was there that Aria slowly began to believe she wasn't broken anymore. Each morning began the same way. Echo would gently nudge her hand awake, resting his chin beside her pillow until her eyes opened. She no longer screamed in the middle of the night. She no longer flinched at loud noises. And she no longer walked the hallways with her head down. She walked like someone who had been rescued from something far deeper than just a physical place. She walked like someone who had been brought back to life. One particular afternoon, as fall leaves swirled around the porch, Dr. Marin Delacroix, head of the trauma recovery team, sat beside Aria with a notebook. They'd been practicing a small ritual together. Every week, Aria wrote a letter she would never send. One for her mother, who had vanished when she was 6. One for the man who had hurt her. And now, today, one for Echo. She held the pencil quietly for a long time, unsure where to begin. Then slowly, she began to write. "Dear Echo, I don't know how you found me. I don't know why you didn't stop even when the world told you to give up. But you came, and you stayed. You were hurt too, maybe more than I was. But you never Ran away. You protected me even when you were bleeding. And when I couldn't speak, you understood anyway. You're not just a dog. You're my soldier. You're the first family I've ever had. And I don't want to go anywhere if you're not going too. She folded the letter and gave it to Dr. Delacroix. But instead of locking it in the usual therapy box, the doctor quietly placed it into an envelope and tucked it into Echo's vest pocket. He'll carry it with him, she said with a soft smile, so he always remembers where he belongs. But fate wasn't done writing their story. One chilly morning, a stranger arrived at the center. He wore a black coat, polished boots, and carried an envelope bearing the Department of Defense seal. Inside was a handwritten letter. Not from a bureaucrat, not from a general, but from Sergeant Benjamin Colton's mother. I know my son died in that final mission. I know Echo was the last piece of him this world had left. But after watching what Echo did for that little girl, after hearing how he refused to let her be forgotten, I've come to believe that maybe a part of my son lived on in him. His discipline, his courage, his refusal to surrender. I won't. Take Echo away from her. I want Arya to keep him. My son would have wanted that too. Arya clutched the letter to her chest and cried for hours, because in that moment the orphan became a daughter again, and the dog with no home became a guardian no one could ever replace. From that day forward, they were inseparable, not just because Echo had rescued her, but because they had rescued each other. He had given her a future. She had given him peace. Months later, Arya stood on a school auditorium stage for the first time, holding a small certificate for bravery in her trembling hands. As applause roared around her, she didn't look at the crowd. She looked at Echo, who sat patiently in the front row, his ears perked, his badge shining in the lights. She didn't speak into the microphone. She just raised the paper toward him and whispered, "This is yours." The audience fell silent, not because they didn't understand, but because they did. The world would remember the headlines, the hospital rescue, the viral photos of a wounded dog beside a broken child. But what truly mattered wasn't what had happened to them. It was what they had become, together, and in a world that often forgets the silent ones, the voiceless, the lost. One brave dog walked into a hospital, carrying not just a girl, but a message that love doesn't always come with words. Sometimes it walks in on 4 legs, bleeding, limping, but unwilling to leave you behind.